Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this presentation from the national headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America. My name is John Chian-Josie. I'm the Director of Public Programs. The goal of the Theosophical Society is to help people explore the spiritual path so as to arrive at a deeper understanding regarding the wisdom of the ages. Furthermore, we feel that this wisdom is not limited to any one tradition, and thus we offer programs from all the traditions. During this period of the COVID-19 pandemic, our national headquarters is closed to the public. However, we are happy to continue bringing you a large number of online programs, including our Thursday evening lectures. Please do visit our website and check under online programs where you'll see, in addition to the Thursday lectures, many classes and workshops which we are offering in Zoom, which is an interactive platform that allows you to ask questions, see the speaker, and see other members of the audience. It is a wonderful way for us to continue supporting your spiritual quest, and it is a good way for you to continue supporting the Theosophical Society. One of the programs that I do want to mention in particular that is coming up on Saturday is the Path to Wholeness, Healing Our Fragmented Selves with Juliana Cesano. This is on Saturday, September 26, 1 to 3:30 p.m. Juliana is a regular teacher here. She teaches Sunday meditation as well as yoga. She is the manager of the Quest Bookshop and highly regarded by many people, and I'm sure that you've heard of her. Her teachings come straight from the heart, and I'm sure that what she will be sharing on Saturday afternoon will be inspiring, useful, and in many ways applicable for your own spiritual aspirations. Please consider joining that workshop on Saturday. Just go to our website and you can register for it. Now, this evening we are happy to have with us Dr. Elizabeth Ann Stewart. She is a board-certified life coach, author, and spiritual director with over 30 years of experience in offering guidance, retreats, and seminars. As a faculty member at DePaul University, she was known as the Great Motivator because of her hallmark teaching skills. She's trained in the art of spiritual direction at the Claret Center, Chicago, and holds a PhD in theology from the University of Malta, and has published over 12 books, including her most recent work, Mind-Shifting Imagery, Image Guidance for Life Coaches. This evening she will speak to us on how to balance your archetypes and become your best self. Please enjoy listening to Elizabeth Ann Stewart. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to How to Balance Your Archetypes and Become Your Best Self. So the question I have for you today is, are you a magician or a wanderer, a warrior, a sage, a fool, perhaps all of the above? Are you a saint, a sinner, a hermit, a contemplative, or none of the above? What we're going to do today is to look at the archetypes that are present in your life and see how perhaps they can be in better balance with one another. To basically see how you can move from the archetype that is dominating your life right now into more of a kaleidoscope of archetypes that provide balance. And so the starting point then is to talk about what an archetype is and perhaps how we can then harness their energy. But let me begin with a little bit of my history with archetypes. I started off my professional life as a poet. And as a poet, I found myself using all kinds of types in my poetry, mostly scripturally based poetry. One of my books, for example, was called Woman Dreamer. And this was a poetry book I wrote for my Doctor of Ministry dissertation or project. And in this book, I take on the persona of different biblical figures. So there's a Jeremiah in the pit, for example, or you have Joseph being sold by her brothers because she's a female Joseph. And so basically I adapt biblical figures for my own work. After that, I was invited to teach a course at Mundelein College called Myths, Signs and Symbols. And in that particular course, I focused on the unconscious and Jungian archetypes and became very excited about the whole world of imagery. And this became my signature class, not only at Mundelein College, but then at DePaul University, at Columbia College, and elsewhere. In the meantime, I began developing my own work with a process called image guidance, which became a way of accessing the unconscious through imagery. And I published 2 books with Paulus Press. This was a long, long time ago now. So the first book came out in, I think it was 1992. And it was called Image Guidance, a Tool for Spiritual Direction. And then it was followed by a sequel, which was Image Guidance and Healing. And then after that, decades later, in fact, it was 2018 when I wrote the follow-up, I wrote a book on mind-shifting imagery. And this is basically how to use imagery in life coaching situations in contrast to therapeutic settings or spiritual direction. So that's a little bit about my fascination with archetypes, that it transcends just a passing interest or a hobby, but basically has been a major part of my professional life, whether as an instructor, a teacher, whether as a healer or a spiritual guide or as a life coach. And so imagery has been part of my work then for decades. So now the question is, how can imagery be part of your experience? So let us begin. First of all, with a definition of archetype. So whether or not we're conscious of this, we are driven by our archetypes in either a positive way or a negative way. We can, in fact, be possessed by our archetypes, whereby they take over our lives for better or worse. And so it is then that we can function as the hero, the inner child, the leader, the teacher, the savior, the warrior, the adventurer, the lover, the caregiver, the inventor, the magician. As you can see, there are multiple kinds of archetypes. The list, in fact, is pretty infinite. I have a list with me right here, which we will see in a slide format. But other examples of archetypes include the creator, the crone, the despot, the destroyer. And so then these forces appear in our lives with great regularity. We also find them in the literature of the world's religions, in sacred stories. We find them in movies, we find them in books. And in fact, one way to become accustomed to identifying archetypes is to look for them in the movies that you're watching and see which character perhaps might be a particular archetype. Which character in the movie is the hero? Which character is the evil personification? Which character is the saving or the savior? So we can look at these figures and see then how they manifest in movies. Sometimes it's easier to watch a movie than to identify the archetypes in our own lives. So Carl Jung spoke of the archetype as residing in the unconscious, that archetypes surface in our lives not only from our private unconscious, but also from the collective unconscious. And so basically, there is a difference then between our own consciousness or unconscious and the collective unconscious. What we know of in our own lives is governed by our own experiences. And so archetypes can surface in our own experience because of where we live, how we were raised, experiences we've had. But then we also tap into the collective unconscious, the unconscious of the whole human race, where there are archetypes which surface not only in us, but also in societies from every age. These archetypes manifest over and over again, regardless of culture, regardless of era, and they just keep on manifesting. So you have what it takes to be a hero then. Those qualities we'll find in any age, in any time. So what the Greeks thought of as a hero is certainly what today we might consider to be heroic, often involving self-sacrifice, for example, putting others first, taking on a dangerous or heroic task, transcending a difficulty. These are all characteristics of the hero that we find are universal. So then, archetypes repeat themselves eternally. And so one way of knowing if this is a private image or an archetype is to see whether it manifests in other cultures than our own. So when the archetype repeats itself in all places at all times, then we indeed know that it is a universal image. Here are some of the archetypes to look out for in your own lives. To be aware that archetypes can lead us into personal freedom, they can lead us into societal order, and they can lead us into making social contributions. So at their best then, archetypes can guide us. The list on the right is a mixture of positive and negative archetypes. There are some archetypes which are intrinsically good, and some archetypes we want to avoid if possible. And there is a difference. So, for example, if we look at the bully, there is no way the bully is going to be a good archetype that one wants to cultivate in one's own life. However, if we look at the destroyer, that has both its positive and negative aspects. It's both benign and also could be negative. Why is that? The bully has no redeeming features, but the destroyer is a necessity. Take, for example, an artist, whether that be a writer, or it could be a musician, it could be an artist, a visual artist. But basically, when one produces a work of art, there's a lot that goes into that work of art that may initially be scrapped. The writer may tear up pages and pages or delete pages and pages from his or her composition. The same with a musician. An artist, a visual artist, may paint over different drafts of a particular work of art. So the destroyer and the creator go hand in hand. And so while on the surface we might imagine that the that the destroyer is a negative image, it actually is a positive archetype. Take, for example, the need to let go of some bad habit. It takes the destroyer in us to be able to let go of that bad habit. Or perhaps we have a bad work experience or a relationship that's not working. If we don't have an archetype of the destroyer in our lives, then we're not going to be able to walk away and start over. So then the archetype of the destroyer is one of these archetypes that is both benign and it can also be negative. So, for example, wanton destruction, looting and pillaging. Those are aspects of the destroyer which are negative. But again, in contrast to the bully, the destroyer archetype is both positive and negative, whereas the bully is intrinsically negative. Let's take another one. At random, I'm just going to go down to the guru, the wise person, the person with a following. It has both benign and negative connotations. So, for example, the guru is the leader, the guru is the wise one, the guru has followers, and hopefully that person will lead others in a positive direction, helping to empower them, helping them to gain positive attributes such as courage and integrity. But the guru can also be on an ego trip. And so the shadow side of the guru can be controlling people, manipulating them, and having followers who basically follow without thinking. And so again, you have an archetype that can be both positive and negative. But then if we go back to the list, I'm going to point at the glutton. There's nothing that's great about the glutton. All of us would agree that gluttony, one of the cardinal sins, is not going to enhance our lives. But in contrast, the one above it, the fool, you might say, well, surely the fool is a negative archetype. And I would counter that by saying that the fool is, yes, that one can be foolish, but then there is the holy fool. Then there is the idea of the fool who speaks truth, as, for example, in King Lear, where we have the jester or the fool speaking truth to King Lear, and then gets sent to bed without supper, probably whipped, and whatever else happens to the fool. I believe the fool dies in King Lear. So anyway, fools can end up badly because they speak truth. My doctoral dissertation for my PhD, in fact, was written on Jesus, the Holy Fool. Some people thought the title was blasphemous, and just by way of a side comment, my dissertation almost brought the Parliament of the World's Religions to a standstill in 1999 when I was presenting in Cape Town, because some people assumed, without having read the book, that it was blasphemous. And then what happened was that Mahatma Gandhi's granddaughter, I think it was Ila Gandhi, basically challenged the South African Parliament and said, how can you condemn the Parliament of the World's Religions on the basis of one book you haven't read? So I did present with a different title, but there were many, many protests saying, go home, Satanists, Jesus is not a holy fool. And also there had to be bomb checks for the auditorium where I was presenting. But the idea of a holy fool for me is the person who basically puts integrity before everything else, who puts others before everything else, the hero who sacrifices the self for the sake of a higher good. And I see in Jesus that very quality of putting himself on the line for the sake of truth, for the sake of beauty, for the sake of integrity, for the sake of love, and being crucified as a result. So then archetypes which on the surface may seem negative can have a very positive aspect. But let's move on. Archetypes as guides. When archetypes are in balance, they help us become our best selves. The hero, for example, teaches us to persist, to deal with struggles, to deal with adversity. Right now, with COVID-19, with social upheavals and so much else going on in the world, we need to be heroes. And that does not necessarily mean rescuing people in distress, but it does mean speaking truth. It does mean being realists, and it does mean having a respect for the common good rather than selfishly endangering other people by our decision making. Take, for example, the sage. The sage offers clarity. And in fact, going back to my friend the fool, the sage is one who provides wisdom. Now, the holy fool or the fool is also a sage in his or her own way. The jester sees things, the jester sees what is real and presents truth in his or her own way, in a way that it can be accepted by the authorities. And so the fool uses jesting, but sometimes the person who seems to be the fool is really the wise one. And the person who seems wise is the imposter who knows nothing beyond what he or she has learnt in books. And then the magician, my very favorite archetype. I believe we're all called to be magicians. And what do magicians do? They change the stuff of life from being ordinary into being filled with passion and gold. Not the gold of wealth, but the gold of what is really important in life, what is essential. The gold of love, the gold of human harmony, the gold of looking after the environment. These are all qualities that the magician will bring. But going back to the whole question of balance, we will see a bit later that the magician can have a negative side where he or she uses knowledge of human nature to control other people. The shadow. Well, the shadow is itself an archetype. The shadow is that aspect of ourselves that we fail to recognize or deal with. I love Carl Jung's language about the shadow, that basically if we do not honor it, if we do not recognize it, it can surface in ways which are very harmful to us. And also it needs to be integrated, and then it can be a source of strength as well as a source of growth. But let's look at the shadow. For Jung, it was anything repressed, forgotten, or ignored. In one of his books, he talks about a car that drives down the street and then disappears around a corner. And he points out that although the car is out of sight, it still exists. We could use a more contemporary analogy of a computer. I don't know about you, but I tend to sometimes inadvertently embed files in other files, inside other files, particularly on external hard drives. And then when it comes time to look for those files, I can't find them. They're still there, but I don't know where they are. And so then it takes a great deal to retrieve them. And sometimes these are very essential files which I need for my work or my own reflection. So what we need to do is to be aware that the shadow exists. It surfaces in our dreams. It also surfaces at random moments. It can be, at some point, it can be a smell, it can be a piece of music that suddenly triggers something that we have repressed, and suddenly memories come sweeping back, and those memories need to be attended to and honored, because if not, they can basically immobilize us or disempower us or make us behave in ways that are totally unexpected. So incorporating that shadow is work of individuation, and it's what makes us into whole and functioning adults. And while on the topic of the shadow, I want to address the whole idea of a national shadow. Certainly the times we're living in, where we're looking at systemic racism, that is part of the shadow of the United States of America, that we have a history of racism that goes back to the days of slavery. We have a history of not just treating others as less than human, but depriving them of basic rights, whether it's a right to education or access to healthcare, whether it's a right to equal employment. And so we have a history then in this country, and that history is part of our national shadow. And as long as we are oblivious to the reality of racism, we're going to continue having social problems. We also have a shadow that is related to our treatment of the indigenous peoples of this continent, to the treatment of all those people who were here before us. We took their lands, we took their freedom, we decimated them, we destroyed them, we killed their culture or tried to. We took away their right to practice their own religion. And so we're left with social fallout. So as part of our national shadow then, we need to examine our roots, our history, and see how many of our social ills that we're dealing with today actually have their roots in the history of where we live. And this is true not just for the USA, it's also true for other countries. For Britain, for example, I grew up both in England and on the island of Malta. My dad was English, my mother was Maltese. And I grew up with a sense of the British Empire. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, but in the 50s, I was reading my dad's books. and all the books he read as a child, and they were all hooray for the British Empire. And I was very proud to be English, and I sort of discounted my Maltese side, thinking that British was better. Until later in life, it didn't take me too long, I think it was a trip to the British Museum, when I began to ask questions about, well, how did all these artifacts get here? Which countries did they come from? Were these artifacts given to England, or were they simply taken? And then I began to identify less and less with my English roots and more with my Maltese roots, and began to see that the history of Malta was one of being colonized, and that I had actually adopted a colonizer's mentality in terms of my own culture. So then that is part of the national shadow of any country that has been colonized, and it's part of Britain's shadow as well. And again, if we look at the social problems facing England today and other parts of the British Isles, we will see that they have their roots in history. And the shadow that is not dealt with is shadow that's going to surface over and over again. I believe that Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu were very aware of this at the end of apartheid in South Africa. And this is why there was the Truth Commission, where Archbishop Tutu asked people to come forward and tell their stories, not just the stories of those who were victimized, but also the stories of the oppressors. And so one by one, people came forward and shared what had happened to them, both as a victim and as an oppressor. And that was the groundwork that Archbishop Tutu was responsible for in terms of moving forward as a country, so that the shadow would not keep on manifesting in negative ways. Jung's iceberg. Well, this is a wonderful image of to understand what the shadow is like. So if we look at the image of the iceberg, it's a great image, you can see what's above the iceberg. And that is what we are conscious of. So all this area that's under the sky and looks white and pristine, that is our conscious selves. It's our conscious individual consciousness. It's our collective consciousness, you might say. It's what we're aware of as individuals and as a society. Now, if you notice, what is below the surface is far more expansive. This part of the iceberg is enormous. And if the Titanic were sort of sailing along here, it might see what's above the surface, but in no way is it going to see the danger lurking below the water level. And so you have a collision. To become fully individuated, integrated human beings, we need to gradually bring to the surface our shadow material. Anything left in the unconscious becomes a detriment to our functioning. Freud, in fact, referred to the unconscious as a cesspit filled with all kinds of harmful items. But Jung had a different perspective. What is above the waterline is what we're conscious of. What is below the waterline can be deadly, but through inner work, we can bring to the surface that material which would otherwise harm us. And when I say inner work, I'm talking about perhaps it's therapy, perhaps it's life coaching, perhaps it's keeping a journal, perhaps it's just taking time for a retreat, time for reflection. It might mean belonging to a support group. It might mean just basically doing a self-inventory and seeing one's life in retrospect and then look forward. But basically, if we do inner work, that material surfaces gradually and can be incorporated, making us stronger and more integrated humans. The problem is when we don't do the inner work, then all this material that's under the surface can explode, and we can have psychotic breaks, we can have midlife crises, we can have all kinds of crises because we have not done our inner work. And this is why it's essential for us as individuals and as countries and as a world, basically, to look at our own shadow, to acknowledge it, and to do our work to bring that shadow to the surface and then incorporate it in positive ways into our own lives. Archetypal addiction. Well, I've talked about the shadow, so this is in a way related to the shadow. But archetypes can also have an addictive quality to them. Let's take, for example, the archetype of the lover. Now, this is a very positive sounding archetype. The lover is the person who loves, whether romantically or in terms of loving other people. But I think of the song, "I Can't Live If Living Is Without You." That sort of reflects an archetypal addiction to love. It may be that we are so much in love with somebody else that we stop living our own lives and only live through and for the other person. It may mean that we are so loving towards a child that we stop the child from growing, smothering the child with love, basically keeping the child from forming significant relationships. It may be that we're so addicted to love that we don't do anything with our lives except for, be lost in the other. And so this seemingly positive archetype can be a negative. And so basically the one who is the lover needs to have more of a wanderer in him or her, and that wanderer will allow the lover to have other focuses than simply the beloved, whether the beloved is a person, a cause, a child, a spouse, who knows, whatever it is we love can possess us. So then we have then this addictive quality to every archetype. The creator, for example, can be addicted to creating. And any of you who have composed music or written books or poetry or any form of writing for that matter, any of you who are into carpentry or any form of creativity whatsoever, whether it's domestic like cooking or crocheting, or whether it's designing buildings and skyscrapers, we can get lost in our creative work to the exclusion of everything else and everyone else. And so it is then that we are possessed by the archetype. We lack balance. And so we have to then be aware of the propensity of an archetype to possess us. No matter how good that archetype is on the surface, it can have negative effects. Archetype as tyrant. Well, as I mentioned earlier, every archetype has its positive dimension and its negative dimension. And so when an archetype is dominant, it can be tyrannical and destructive. So here we have the beautiful queen who can be the wicked witch. I think of the queen, the beautiful ice queen in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And there she is, this beautiful, beautiful queen who has a heart of ice and destruction. The benign ruler can be the ogre tyrant. If I think about rulers, meaning leaders, we have many different historical examples to look at. Gandhi, you could say, was an enlightened leader. Hitler committed genocide and was a leader. Two very different styles of leadership. And so for one, leading meant empowerment of the people, and for the other, leadership or being a ruler meant domination of the world. And I've spoken about the magician as well. The magician can become the evil sorcerer. So the magician can work magic, heal others, bring harmony, but the magician can also cause great mischief. The unhealthy warrior. Well, men are very often under the warrior archetype. and very combative, seldom taking time for reflection, not really nurturing their inner lives or developing meaningful relationships. This is very much an old model of masculinity, where the man keeps everything in and doesn't basically share his inner world with anyone else. So the idea of surrender or letting go seem absolutely foreign to this model of masculinity, the unhealthy warrior. Those kinds of ideals are in complete opposite to the stereotypical ideas of masculinity, which have to do with being in control, with fighting, with putting down one's enemies. If I think about the Beatitudes in the Christian scriptures, they are completely contrary to this view of masculinity. So instead of making war, it's blessed are the peacemakers. Similarly, blessed are they who weep and mourn. Complete contradictions to this archetype of masculinity. Unfortunately, many men in Western culture are raised with this concept of masculinity. Not so much perhaps in the present generation, not so much for millennials, not so much for Gen Z, or the iGen, however you want to refer to them. But certainly for my generation of baby boomers, for the generation that came before mine, and then my children's generation, Gen X, this view of masculinity was pretty much the view that was imposed on men to their detriment, which meant that that rather than having opportunities to cultivate an inner world, the idea was to develop military kinds of skills. And any male who did not fit into these categories was then looked down upon as not being male enough. Conversely, many women of the same generations that I've referred to were raised with the idea of the unhealthy martyr. Now, thank goodness this is not really the case, I don't believe, for millennials or for Gen Z, at least not in Western culture. There are other cultures, however, where this very unhealthy image for women still prevails, particularly in cultures where women are where women have few rights. So the unhealthy martyr then, the term martyr is another term for caregiver. And women are often gripped by this archetype and conditioned to be caregivers from very early on. So for example, children playing with dolls at a very young age, or learning to play with a tea set, or learning how to create a home, or do the kinds of domestic things that they see their mothers doing. Now, there's nothing very wrong with that unless it's the only way a child is raised. So if a little girl, for example, is raised with the idea of being a caregiver, it would be far better if she's also raised with the idea of being a warrior, that is, being able to stand up for her own rights, and being a wanderer, having the opportunity to explore. And conversely, little boys, if they're going to be raised with traditional images of masculinity, it would be far healthier if they're also exposed to doing some caregiving things. And this is where having unisex kinds of toys and experiences becomes invaluable, where both girls and boys are nurtured to be caregivers, as well as to learn how to be wanderers, that is, those people who can leave home eventually, and also warriors, that is, those who can stand up for their rights and the rights of others. When women are gripped by the caregiver or the martyr archetype, they basically let go or give up on or surrender any of their own dreams, wishes, and desires to either do as they're told or to cater to somebody else's needs, to take care of the responsibilities in the home. Sometimes at a very young age, girls end up caring for younger siblings, and then as they grow older, they may take over household tasks, and then they find themselves not only raising their own children, but perhaps looking after grandparents or parents, and so their whole lives then are spent in caregiving. And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with caregiving, but one needs to love oneself first, that there is a place for self-love. And so a healthy martyr is somebody who does love self and does seek to have some balance whereby she or he is honoring those dreams and wishes and desires that otherwise might be cast aside. An example of a very unhealthy martyr. I remember when I was 7 years old, we had a teacher called Miss Annie, and I was in Malta at that time in a Catholic school, and we were being prepared for our first Holy Communion. And so Miss Annie was telling us about this saint whose claim to fame was that she was warned by a gardener that if she didn't commit the sin of impurity with him, he was going to kill her the next day. Now, I'm trying to remember this saint's name, and I'm afraid it's escaped me. Oh, Maria Goretti, there we go. So Maria Goretti went home and didn't say anything to any of the adults, and she thought about the threat she had received, and instead of seeking adult assistance, she went back to the gardener, or whoever it was, and told him that she was not going to commit the sin of impurity, whatever it was, with him, and he stabbed her to death. So then we were taught, as 7-year-olds, that better to die than to commit the sin of impurity. And at 7, I had no idea what that meant. But today's 7-year-olds probably would. But in the 1950s, I had no idea what a sin of impurity was. But the message was then that better to die than to lose one's chastity or virginity or whatever else. And so she was canonized, and this was a saint we were supposed to emulate and think of as we prepared for our first Holy Communion. And I remember being shocked and horrified by this image. And today I would just say that the way it was presented to us was that of a very unhealthy archetype of the martyr. Now, sometimes life is out of balance, not because we have archetypal possession, not because we're living out of the shadow dimensions of an archetype, but perhaps because an archetype is missing. And I love this image. I found it on the internet. It's not one that I created. Obviously, this is sort of an American Gothic, a famous painting that hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. And there you have two people looking tremendously serious, you know, completely distracted from life, just holding onto their phones for dear life, and looking so deadly serious. There is no fool in these two individuals. And when I say fool, I'm talking about the archetype of fun, of laughter. I'm talking about not inebriation and the shadow side of the fool, but rather the side of the fool that has to do with being fully alive. And that is missing in this particular photo or work of art. So in the West, there are many of us who suffer from this insufficiency of fool. We are frenetic. We take ourselves too seriously. We don't take out time to play. And the result is that our lives become devoid of color and devoid of possibility. When I'm working with clients in life coaching or spiritual direction, I sometimes have them use crayons to get in touch with the child within, or have them do something a little bit ridiculous to get them out of their very serious selves. I have one client who has vowed to make a trip to the Morton Arboretum only so she can hug a few trees. And she just needs to be connected to nature. And so one way of doing this is going to be through some tree hugging. This sounds silly, but it's necessary. And sometimes it's the silliness that we're missing that makes our lives dry and arid. So we forget that playfulness is a human need. We shackle ourselves to our calendars, and we do nothing unless it's scheduled. We become bored, exhausted, depressed, losing all spontaneity, authenticity, and passion. I actually have one of my poems called Nazareth Sequences. I sort of describe in that poem what this world is like. And I'm just going to read a little bit of what life can be like when people miss out on the fool, or they miss out on the archetype of just being alive. They do not know. They have not seen. They have neither felt nor touched nor tasted the power and glory of owning and letting go, of being and letting be. They have not probed beneath the skin for subtle signs of mystery, or studied the harmony of opposites present in yin and yang, animus and anima. They have not heard life's rhythms pulse beneath the rain-drenched earth, or whisper in the greening leaves of lilacs and magnolias. They have not smelled the fragrance carried by the wind, caressed by gentle breezes, nor have they felt its beat, throbbing in the heart of a child. No, they have seen only boundaries, barriers, and dichotomies, rifts between body and soul, man and woman, saved and damned, divisions wide as gaping canyons, bloody as war. They dwell in a crumbling house, teetering on termite-ridden frame. Their resources dwindle in trade. They lavish wages on refuse, remembering neither their beginning nor their ending, nor the days in between, neither kairos nor chronos, nor things of significance. What they know are limits and restrictions, brick walls without doors, concrete cells sans windows. For them, life is function, rote and predictable, their God, big brother, omniscient, omnipotent, the feared puppeteer who pulls the strings this way and that, jerking obedience from wooden mannequins. And that's what happens with an insufficiency of fool, with an insufficiency of the inner child, when we let the grown-up self become too serious. So how do we achieve balance? To be in balance, we need to be both sages and fools, creators and destroyers, martyrs and warriors. Sages are truly wise if they can laugh at themselves every now and again. And fools save themselves from excessive debauchery, you might say, by cultivating wisdom, even as they romp and frolic across the stage of life. Apparently, in the medieval world and even in the Renaissance world, the jester was quite outrageous. The jester, for example, would jump on the table while people were eating, may grab a chicken, whether dead or alive, I'm not sure, and rip it apart and eat it and chomp on it and just do incredibly obscene things right on the table where everybody was feasting. So that's an example of the debauchery of the jester. But then you have the jester or the fool who can speak truth and tell the king, as in the case of King Lear, "Thou had precious little wit in thy royal head when you gave your crown away," or something to that effect. In other words, King Lear gave his royal crown away and showed foolishness for letting his children rule in his stead. And creators, as I mentioned before, can only mature in their craft when they learn how to destroy. One of the questions we can ask is, what archetypes manifest in different areas of our lives? Because although there may be a dominant archetype that shows up, very often there may be a different archetype that manifests in different places in our lives. So the question then, which archetypes manifest in these areas of your life? Let's look at spirituality. It may be that the archetype of the contemplative surfaces, or the archetype of the priest, or the archetype of the hermit, the archetype of the saint, the archetype of the mystic. Those may be archetypes that manifest there. Or in terms of play, it may be the child, it may be the fool, maybe some other archetype. You don't want to be a tyrant when you're playing, for sure. In terms of community service, it may be the martyr or the caregiver, the person who loves others and puts them first. It may be the leader, the person who's going to set the example or call people into service. In terms of the family, it could be the nurturer, the mother, the father. We don't want to see tyrants in the home, for sure. In terms of self-care, it may be the athlete, it may be the healer, depending on which archetypes are grabbing us at a particular point of time. Of course, in work study, it could be the teacher, it could be the student. You don't want to be the child in the world of work and study, because then things won't get done, nor do you want to really be the fool in that particular arena. So as part of our archetypal assessment, we need to be aware of what archetypes are operating at any given time. I was recently facilitating some group conversations for an organization, a global organization, and my task was simply to facilitate. And the topic we were looking at actually was archetypes, and those who signed up, it turned out, had no idea what an archetype was. So what I ended up doing was switching for a brief period of time from being a facilitator into being the teacher. And my peers, life coaches, all became students in that moment. And then when I felt they had the groundwork they needed for a general discussion, then I stepped back into my role as facilitator, stopped being the teacher, and let the others participate with their own contributions. But I was very conscious about switching roles, and I asked permission of the group. And I said, technically, in this particular forum, my role is that of a facilitator. I'm simply supposed to, encourage conversation and make sure everybody gets a chance to participate. But since nobody has any idea on the topic, and I have some ideas, then with your permission, I'm going to give you a brief overview, and then we'll have a general conversation. And so everybody was in agreement, and I could do that. But I had to be consciously aware of how I was shifting roles. So too in any counseling situation. The person who is counseling or serving as a guide to another, or doing life coaching or spiritual direction or mentoring, if that person suddenly becomes an equal with the person being guided, there's a shift in roles, and sometimes the person being guided ends up guiding the person who was supposed to be doing the guiding and maybe being paid for it. And so that can be an interesting role that we have to look out for anyone who offers inner guidance. A more familiar example can be when the parent becomes the child and the child becomes the parent. And this can happen even with young children, where, let's say, mother or father's having a bad day, and the child says some words of wisdom to help the parent shift back to being the parent. I remember many, many years ago, my mother-in-law died, and I was sitting on a staircase. I just got the news. I was crying. And my son, who was probably just 2, disappeared and came over to me with a handful of radishes he found in the fridge. Now, why he gave me radishes, I don't know. They're not particularly my favorite food. But he gave me the radishes with the words, "Here, Mom, these will make you better." So in that moment, he became the caregiver or the parent, calling me back to being his mother and not basically being absent from him. So at that moment, I was the child and he was the mother-father, in a very tender, sweet moment. So important then to know which archetypes are operating. Question 1 is, which is your dominant archetype? Which is the one that shows up the most? Which is the one that controls your life the most? So which drives you with the greatest energy? To know which our dominant archetype is, which is the one that is really the most energetic right now? There have been different times in my life when different archetypes have operated. Even though the teacher archetype has been a constant, the poet has been a constant, my mother archetype was certainly stronger when the children were home, and that now they're young adults, so I'm less of, that archetype has less force in my life. But different circumstances demand different archetypes, and so to be aware of which is dominant right now. For some it may be the archetype of the survivor. For some it may be the archetype of being a healer. So it really depends on your life right now. The next question is, what does this dominant archetype, how does this dominant archetype manifest in your life? Is it in positive ways or negative ways? Is your dominant archetype life-giving or death-dealing, or a combination of the two? And when I talk about life-giving and death-dealing, it's the same thing about the positive and the negative aspects of archetypes. What are the positive aspects of your dominant archetype, and what are its negative aspects? So if I go to the teacher archetype, certainly the positive is providing a body of information, providing a learning experience, providing a sense of empowerment for the group that I'm working with. The shadow side, of course, could be that in my eagerness, in my enthusiasm to share my body of knowledge and my experience, I may overlook the body of knowledge and experience sitting right before me. And so as teacher, I need to also create a circle of inclusion for everybody in my class and make sure everybody has a voice. So we really are a community of learners, with me not as the dominant teacher, but rather part of a learning community. And so that's an example of awareness of the positive and negative dimensions of an archetype and playing to the positive instead of the negative. So balancing our archetypes. What other archetypes are already present in your life that might provide more balance where you might need it? And what other archetypes might you invite into your life to become more balanced? And this is where we need to know what is dominant and then how we can be in greater balance. So let's take the innocent, the archetype of the innocent one, the naive one. An innocent child is wonderful, but when you have an adult who behaves like an innocent child and has no street smarts and lets everybody take advantage of him or her, then the balance that is needed there is for the person to grow in wisdom, to become the sage, and perhaps the warrior as well. So if somebody is gripped by the innocent archetype, the antidote for that being a negative would be to cultivate wisdom and also the wandering or the exploring aspect of life. If somebody is a warrior, then the caregiver becomes the natural way of balancing the warrior. The warrior who knows how to love develops this wholeness to life. My father was a military man. He was 6 months away from completing a law degree when World War II broke out. And at 19, he joined the British Army and then stayed in the military, having seen action in the worst parts of the world all during the war years. And my dad sort of remained a warrior kind of figure, even in the way he ran the family. And I remember as a small child being rather intimidated by him. But when my mother became ill with advanced dementia, he became the caregiver, and there was a softness that developed in my dad that complemented the warrior, that he became far more integrated and found balance in that dimension of caregiving for my mother, his wholehearted 100% commitment where nothing was enough for her. And to the very end of his life, he put all his energy and effort into making my mother's life one that was meaningful and significant, and honoring her in every way possible. The self. We're coming to the end here of this presentation, but Carl Jung talked about the self as being the archetype of integration, that basically when we get rid of our egos, when we get rid of all, and I'm talking about the unhealthy ego now, I'm talking about those negative aspects, our shadow aspects, when we can move into being our own authentic, individuated selves, a higher self, a higher form of consciousness surfaces. And so then the self is the archetype of the perfect human. And for Christians, the self is represented by the Christ. And so the task of the Christian is to become the Christ in his or her own life's context. And so too for the Buddhist, the self would be Buddha consciousness, to reach a place of enlightenment that replaces the limited state of consciousness that we would otherwise have. And in every religious tradition, we have this higher sense of consciousness that is what the devotee aspires towards, to become not just who we are in the present tense, but a higher self that's fully conscious and fully individuated. We become a new creation, to use the words of St. Paul. In theistic traditions, the self is where we encounter the divine. It's where Atman, or individual soul, and Brahman, or world soul, become one. And so it is that the soul within me honors the soul within you. It's my higher consciousness, my higher awareness, recognizing you as a spiritual being. And so this then is what happens when we do our work of archetypal balancing. We're able to purify ourselves by bringing the shadow elements in our lives into control, into balance, into harmony. And so we find then, by becoming detached from the shadow dimensions of our archetypes, we find the freedom of our own authentic, real selves. And so the spiritual quest becomes a quest for the elusive self, a terrifying journey of ego abandonment that leads to bliss. Because when we leave behind the shadow, we're leaving behind habits and attitudes and beliefs that were limiting and possibly destructive, not only for ourselves, but to others. Of course, the ruler wants to be admired, but the real ruler is the one who has mastery over the self. And of course, the ruler wants to have followers, but the real ruler is the one who empowers the followers, not puts them in a place of oppression or being dominated. And so it is we have to let go our old attitudes and embrace the positive, and this becomes possible when we balance our archetypes. And so if you want to explore 12 archetypes, and these are just 12 that I'm focusing on. I mean, there are so many, countless archetypes, it's impossible to really come up with them all. But I've identified a number of archetypes, and the ones I'm focusing on are the healer, the teacher, the sage, the shaman, the savior, the mystic, the prophet, the dreamer, the judge, the guide, the companion, the listener. These are archetypes that I believe surface in the spiritual quest, and they surface in those who are offering spiritual guidance as well as those who are receiving it. And so if you're interested in learning more, I do have an archetypal profile quiz, and all you have to do is send me an email, or you can contact me through my website, elizabethanstewart.com. and I will send you the quiz with instructions on how to interpret the results. So basically, you will do your own interpretation of your results. Just as with dream imagery, the person who understands the dream is the dreamer, so too with archetypes, you, the one who has the archetypes within yourself, are the one who has the power to interpret them. You know whether they're in balance, you know whether they're dominating, you know whether they're healthy, you know whether they're unhealthy, you know whether you're possessed, or you know whether you're becoming a saint. So if you want to explore these archetypes, feel free to contact me. Just quickly, a couple of authors that I recommend. Carol Pearson in the 80s, 90s, wrote on the hero within and has some quizzes on the hero journey in both her books. But they both have to do with the hero journey. Somebody else I was reading a lot at that time was Robert Johnson. But the 80s, 1980s were a time of great flourishing of archetypal studies. But there's a whole wealth of archetypal material out there. And I hope you find it as exciting as I do. And I would love to hear from you if you're interested in learning more. So thanks for your attention to this. And I hope you enjoy the balancing act in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that presentation. I hope that our audience enjoyed it and found it helpful for their spiritual search. Once again, I'd like to invite you to join us next Thursday when our speaker will be Michael Albro from Fermi Lab, and he will be speaking on miracles in our universe, deconstructing the Goldilocks principle. I am sure that it will be an intriguing lecture from the scientific perspectives, breaking new grounds in our understanding of our natural world. Please do join us Thursday next week. And of course, do look at our website and consider participating in all our other online programs. In the meantime, please stay safe and be well. Good night.